Emily Hayes was desperate for a fresh start. After a messy divorce and losing her job, she moved with her teenage daughter, Sophie, to a small, secluded house in Hollow Creek, hoping that the quiet town would bring them peace. The house was old but charming, surrounded by tall trees and wildflower meadows. It seemed like the perfect place to rebuild their lives. On their first night, the house was oddly quiet, save for the distant hooting of owls. Emily was unpacking boxes in the living room when Sophie called out from the hallway. "Mom, did you hear that?" Sophie's voice was tinged with fear. Emily paused, listening intently. There was a faint sound, like the soft tapping of fingers against glass. But after a few moments, it stopped. "It's probably just the house settling," Emily reassured her daughter with a forced smile. Sophie didn't look convinced, but she nodded and went to bed. That night, Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked and groaned, as old houses do, but there was something different in those sounds, something almost deliberate. She was just starting to drift off when she heard it again. Tap. 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 This time, it was unmistakable. She got up and walked down the hall to Sophie's room, where she found her daughter wide awake, clutching her blanket. "It's coming from the walls," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Emily pressed her ear to the wall but heard nothing. "It's just your imagination, sweetie," she said, though she couldn't quite convince herself. The unseen presence the following days were a blur of unpacking and trying to settle in, but the strange occurrences only intensified. Lights flickered for no apparent reason, doors creaked open on their own, and cold drafts swept through the house, even on the warmest days. Sophie was convinced that the house was haunted, but Emily dismissed it as nerves. She couldn't afford to move again, not after all she had already sacrificed. One evening, Emily was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a loud crash from the living room. She rushed in to find that the bookshelf had toppled over, books and knick-knacks scattered across the floor. Sophie stood in the doorway, trembling. "I saw it move by itself, Mom. I swear," she cried. "Don't be ridiculous," Emily snapped, though her heart was racing. She had heard stories of poltergeists before, mischievous spirits that caused chaos in people's homes. But those were just stories, weren't they? As they picked up the scattered books, Emily's hand brushed against a faded, yellowed piece of paper that had fallen out of one of the old books she'd inherited from her grandmother. It was a letter, dated over 50 years ago, detailing the tragic story of a woman named Margaret who had lived in the house. According to the letter, Margaret had lost her child to illness and had gone mad with grief. She had taken her own life in one of the upstairs rooms. The haunting escalates that night. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air in the house was thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. Sophie refused to sleep alone, so they bunked together in Emily's room. Around midnight, Emily woke up to a freezing chill enveloping the room. The temperature had dropped so drastically that she could see her breath misting in the air. Then, she heard it again, tap, 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 like fingernails rapping against the headboard. Terrified, Emily turned on the bedside lamp, but the light flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, a whisper echoed through the room. "Leave my house," Sophie screamed, and Emily fumbled for her phone's flashlight. When she finally managed to turn it on, she saw it. A dark shadow standing in the corner, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the cold, menacing presence lingered. Breathless and shaking, Emily held Sophie close. "We're leaving tomorrow," she whispered, though she wasn't sure where they could go. But the entity had other plans. As they tried to leave the house the next morning, they discovered that the front door was stuck, as if glued shut. The windows refused to budge, and the air inside seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. It was as if the house itself was alive, determined to keep them inside. The discovery desperate for answers, Emily searched the house from top to bottom, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. In the dusty attic, she discovered a hidden room sealed behind an old bookshelf. The air inside was stale, the floor covered in dust, but there, in the center of the room, was an old, crumbling dollhouse. It was a perfect replica of their house. As she leaned in to examine it, Emily's heart nearly stopped. Inside the miniature living room was a tiny figure of herself, standing exactly where she was in that moment. In the dollhouse version of Sophie's room, there was a small, shadowy figure standing over a doll that looked just like her daughter. Panicking, Emily grabbed the dollhouse and ran downstairs. But as soon as she entered the living room, the lights flickered, and the front door slammed shut behind her. Sophie screamed from upstairs, her voice filled with terror. Emily raced up the stairs, clutching the dollhouse. She found Sophie pinned against the wall by an invisible force, her feet dangling above the ground. The air was filled with a deafening roar, like 1,000 angry whispers layered on top of one another. "Let her go," Emily screamed, shaking the dollhouse. To her shock, the shadowy figure in the miniature version of Sophie's room began to move. Desperate, Emily grabbed the tiny shadow figure and ripped it out of the dollhouse. Instantly, Sophie dropped to the ground, gasping for air. But the nightmare wasn't over. The house began to shake violently, the walls cracking as the poltergeist's fury reached its peak. Emily realized that the only way to break the curse was to destroy the dollhouse. With all her strength, she hurled it to the ground and stomped on it, smashing it to pieces. A blood-curdling scream filled the house as a dark, swirling mist erupted from the broken dollhouse. The air grew frigid, and for a moment, Emily felt as though icy fingers were wrapping around her throat. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight in the air lifting. The aftermath: Emily and Sophie didn't stay to find out if the spirit was truly gone. They fled the house with nothing but the clothes on their backs, driving away from Hollow Creek without looking back. A week later, Emily received a phone call from the real estate agent who had sold her the house. "You're not the first family to flee that house," the agent confessed reluctantly. The previous owners claimed it was haunted, too, but no one ever believed them. Emily hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She and Sophie had moved into a cramped apartment in the city, where they hoped the spirit wouldn't find them. But every so often, in the dead of night, Emily would wake up to a soft tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. And she knew, deep down, that the poltergeist of Hollow Creek wasn't finished with them yet.